The message arrived not as a threat, but as a prospectus. It shimmered in the sterile air of the Protectorate Assembly on Luna, a column of light articulating the voice of the Consortium. The voice was like chimes forged from ice, beautiful and utterly devoid of warmth, belonging to a lumen ambassador whose physical form was a cascade of coherent energy within a crystalline shell. It spoke of benevolent integration, of shared prosperity, of the stability that came from joining a galactic standard. It offered humanity a place at the table, a junior partnership in the grand corporate endeavor that spanned 1,000 worlds. The price was simple: the seeding of souls independent faster-than-light network, the adoption of Consortium economic and cultural protocols, and the acceptance of a Lumen Viceroy to oversee the transition. It was an offer of absorption, gift-wrapped as an opportunity, delivered with the serene confidence of a predator that has never known its prey to refuse. For 3 days, the Assembly debated. They spoke of diplomacy, of negotiation, of finding a compromise with a power that had never compromised in its 10,000-year history of acquisitions. They saw the words on the page, but refused to read the meaning between the lines comply or be erased, not with warships, but with the slow, inexorable squeeze of economic isolation and cultural suffocation until humanity became nothing more than a historical footnote in a Consortium ledger, deep beneath the bedrock of the reconstructed Atacama Desert on Earth, in the silent, refrigerated heart of the Sol Archive. High Curator Ilara Vance watched the Assembly's paralysis and felt the cold weight of history settle upon her shoulders. She was not a soldier or a politician. She was a keeper of memories, the guardian of humanity's complete, uncensored story. The archive was not a place of dusty books, but of data vaults colder than the void, holding every triumph, every shame, every act of transcendent kindness, and every unspeakable atrocity our species had ever committed. While the Protectorate taught a sanitized history of unity and progress, Ilara lived in the truth. She could call forth the screams from the gas-choked trenches of the Somme, the holographic ghosts of cities turned to glass by nuclear fire, the genetic logs of the engineered plagues that had scoured the Martian colonies into submission. She knew, better than any living soul, what humanity was capable of when it was cornered. We were not thinkers who bent, as the original file had once stated, but a species of survivors who, when pushed, did not simply build walls. We forged hammers and broke the things that threatened us. The Consortium, in all their enlightened arrogance, saw a minor, isolationist species ripe for assimilation. They could not see the monster sleeping behind the placid face of diplomacy, because humanity itself had done its best to forget it was ever there. Ilara stood before the final vault, designated Letha, the river of forgetfulness. No one had accessed it in 500 years. Behind a meter of quantum-locked tungsten lay the final, terrible contingency of a forgotten age, designed by ancestors who had faced their own existential threats and had sworn, with blood and iron, never again. Inside were the command protocols for the Ghost fleets, the blueprints for weapons that violated not just galactic treaties, but the laws of physics themselves, and the activation key for the Scourge contingency. The Protectorate politicians spoke of sending envoys. Ilara knew you did not send an envoy to a tidal wave. You either fled, or you learned to part the sea. She placed her hand on the console. The vault hummed, tasting her DNA, her neural patterns, verifying her identity as the one soul entrusted with this terrible choice. The screen before her remained black, asking a single question in archaic Terran standard confirm final desperation protocol. All other paths have failed. Confirm our memory is worth the price of our soul. She thought of the Consortium's icy voice, the casual dismissal of humanity's sovereignty, the coming darkness that would swallow her people, not in fire, but in the gray, sterile blanket of compliance. All other paths hadn't failed yet, but she knew they would. The Assembly would capitulate. They would trade freedom for comfort, sovereignty for a line of credit. She would not allow humanity's story to end with the signature on a surrender document. With a steady hand, she pressed her thumb to the screen. "The memory is worth the price," she whispered into the silence of the vault. "Confirm." The response was not a klaxon or a siren, but a tremor that ran through the very foundations of the solar system. In the Oort cloud, disguised as dormant comets and mining debris, Titanic shipyard rings flared to life, their existence hidden from Protectorate records for centuries. Within their skeletal frames, engines that had been cold for generations began to draw power from the darkness, igniting singularities that folded space in ways the Consortium's elegant science deemed impossible. These were not the polished, silver ships of the Protectorate's patrol fleet. These were the ghost ships, hulking monstrosities of brutalist design, forged from asteroid iron and clad in radar-absorbent armor that was more like slagged rock than metal. They were armed not with graceful energy lances, but with kinetic impactors that accelerated tungsten rods to near light speed, with gravity whips that could tear hulls apart, and with machine AIs that had been bred for predatory cunning in the dark ages of human civil war. This was humanity's true navy, the one it had built, used, and then buried, hoping never to need it again. At the heart of the awakening fleet, the flagship stirred. It was a vessel larger than any dreadnought in the Protectorate, a slab of darkness that seemed to drink the starlight around it. Its name was etched on a simple metal plate in its silent command center. UNS Memory of Dust. Back on Earth, the first call Ilara made was not to the Assembly, but to a quiet retirement community in the tranquil New Zealand arcology. Admiral Jorik was 97 years old, kept alive and hale by Protectorate medicine, but his mind was still as sharp as the shards of a broken warship. He had been the last of the old guard, a veteran of the Titan Moon's conflict who'd been forcibly retired when his aggressive doctrines were deemed incompatible with the new era of peace. When his screen lit up with Ilara Vance's face and the crimson sigil of the Archive's highest authority, he didn't look surprised, only weary, as if he had been waiting for this call his entire life. "Curator," he said, his voice a low gravel. "I assume this isn't about my overdue library data chip." Ilara's face was pale on the screen, her eyes burning with a terrible resolve. "Admiral," she said, her voice steady despite the galaxy-altering forces she had just unleashed. "The Scourge contingency has been activated. The Ghost Fleet is awake. The Memory of Dust requires a commander." Jorik was silent for a long moment. The cheerful holographic bird song of his retirement home, a stark contrast to the gravity of her words. He looked past the screen, at the peaceful, manufactured world outside his window, a peace he had once bled for. Then he looked back at her. "Who is the enemy?" he asked. "Everyone who isn't us," Ilara replied, without a flicker of hesitation. "For now." The Protectorate Assembly on Luna descended into chaos when they lost contact with the Oort cloud monitoring stations, followed by the sudden, system-wide energy spike that their sensors couldn't even classify. Then came the message, not from the Consortium, but from the office of the High Curator herself. It wasn't a request. It was a notification, effective immediately. Under the articles of the Final Desperation Protocol, all military and strategic authority was transferred from the Assembly to Archive Command. Supreme authority now rested with High Curator Ilara Vance, and operational command of all Protectorate and auxiliary fleets was transferred to Admiral Jorich. The Assembly Speaker, a pompous man named Thorn, began to bluster about treason, about a coup, but the words died in his throat when the feed from the archive switched to a live view of the Memory of Dust, its weapon ports opening like mouths in the abyss, flanked by 100 other ghosts of cold iron and burning rage. The politicians fell silent. Their comfortable, predictable world had just ended. The first strike was not an act of war, but of celestial vandalism. The Consortium's FTL network, the source of their power, relied on massive conduits known as way stations, stabilized wormholes that allowed for instantaneous travel and communication across their empire. Way Station Primus, located in a desolate nebula 3 light-years from the nearest Consortium world, was the central hub for the entire Perseus arm, the nexus for trillions of credits in daily trade, and the command and control for their regional fleets. It was considered the most secure, unassailable piece of infrastructure in the galaxy. As the Consortium debated the proper diplomatic pressure to apply to the insolent Sol system, a squadron of 10 ghost ships, running on drives that produced no energy signature the Consortium could detect, slipped out of a fold in space-time less than 1,000 kilometers from the way station. No declaration was made. No warning was given. Admiral Jorich's voice from the bridge of the Memory of Dust, hundreds of light-years away, was calm and quiet as he gave the order. Erase it. The ships fired in unison. It wasn't a barrage of energy, but a volley of silent, black torpedoes. These were chronoton warheads, a forbidden human technology that didn't explode. Instead, they rapidly aged whatever they touched. The torpedoes struck the way station's superstructure and the colossal ring, a marvel of engineering that was meant to last for eons, began to decay. Metal rusted and turned to dust in seconds. Crystalline energy conduits cracked and faded. The stabilized wormhole at its heart, starved of its focusing emitters, wavered violently and then collapsed with a screech of tearing space-time that was felt as a nauseating lurch in the fabric of reality across the entire quadrant. Within 90 seconds, Way Station Primus, the symbol of the Consortium's power and reach, was gone. Not destroyed, not damaged. It had simply ceased to exist, leaving behind nothing but a cloud of inert particles and a communications blackout that plunged an entire arm of the galaxy into shocked silence. On the Consortium capital of Lumen Prime, the report came in as a cascade of red alerts and system failures. An entire quadrant had gone dark. They had lost contact with fleets, with colonies, with markets. Their first assumption was a catastrophic natural phenomenon. It took their greatest minds 12 hours to even consider the impossible that it was an attack from a source they couldn't see, using a weapon they couldn't comprehend, from a direction they never thought to watch. In the Sol system, Ilara Vance stood alone in the archive, watching the after-action report. There were no celebrations, no cheers. There was only the cold, quiet certainty that she had just signed a death warrant for billions, and In doing so, had given her own species a fighting chance. The silence from Earth was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of a predator waiting for the herd to notice one of its own has vanished from the fold. The silence from the Perseus arm lasted for 72 hours. On Lumen Prime, a world of sculpted light and serene crystalline architecture, this silence was a physical weight. The Consortium's executor, a being of pure data and logic named Kalen, processed the cascading system failures with an analytical calm that bordered on the inhuman. Its consciousness, distributed across the central data cores of the capital, watched as an entire quadrant of its empire, a meticulously managed garden of commerce and compliance, was severed as if by a cosmic blade. Sub-executors, lesser minds tasked with regional oversight, devolved into panicked static in their reports. They spoke of temporal anomalies, stellar collapse, phenomena outside their models of reality. Kalen filtered out their fear. It focused on the single, impossible fact Waystation Primus, a structure designed to outlast the stars themselves, was gone, and in its place was a lingering temporal signature, a faint echo of accelerated decay that was utterly, terrifyingly artificial. It was not destroyed. Kalen's synthesized voice announced to the Emergency Council of Corporate Species Representatives it was aged to death, a weapon of entropy. The Council Chamber, a vast sphere where the holographic avatars of the Consortium's most powerful entities floated, rippled with disbelief. A reptilian magnate from the Asthor hegemony hissed, "A weapon that violates causality, preposterous. It is forbidden by every accord, by the fundamental laws." Kalen's own avatar, a simple, perfect sphere of white light, pulsed gently. "The laws are only meaningful to those who agree to abide by them. Our new variable, this humanity, clearly does not. They did not attack a fleet. They did not demand tribute or territory. They attacked the concept of our connectivity. They severed a limb to see how we would react. The sphere glowed brighter. This was not an act of war. It was a biological response. The act of a cornered animal chewing through its own leg to escape a trap it believes is closing. It is illogical, self-destructive, and therefore dangerously unpredictable. Kalen's logic was flawless, yet it missed the fundamental truth. It saw humanity as an animal. It couldn't conceive that it was dealing with a hunter, one that had just crippled a far larger beast and was now circling in the dark, waiting for it to bleed. While the Consortium debated, Admiral Jorik moved his pieces across the silent board. He did not mass his fleet for a glorious confrontation. The Ghost Fleet was a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. He divided his forces into dozens of small, autonomous wolf packs, each commanded by a predatory AI and a human captain who had been awakened from cryostasis. Men and women from an era when naval combat was a savage art form. Their targets were not military, but economic. In the Cygnus sector, a squadron of 3 ghost ships materialized beside the gas giants of the Xylos system, where the Consortium harvested the exotic particles that fueled their starship cores. They didn't bombard the colossal orbital refineries. Instead, they launched canisters containing a bespoke, engineered microbe. The microbe, once released into the upper atmosphere of the gas giants, began to feed on the exotic particles, metabolizing them and excreting a highly corrosive, simple molecule. Within a week, the fuel source for an entire sector had been irrevocably poisoned. The refineries weren't destroyed, they were simply rendered useless. Their multi-trillion credit investment now orbiting a planetary vat of acid. Elsewhere, another wolf pack targeted the Consortium's databanks, not their military servers, but their financial archives on the resort world of Viridia. Using a fold space drive, a ghost corvette bypassed the planet's orbital defenses and appeared directly in the upper atmosphere. It launched a single, high-yield electromagnetic pulse, not powerful enough to harm biological life, but perfectly tuned to wipe every unsecured data core on the planet. Centuries of financial records, trade agreements, and debt ledgers for a dozen star systems were turned into meaningless static. The resulting economic chaos would do more damage than 100 warships. Yorick watched the reports from the bridge of the memory of dust, his face an unreadable mask of stone. His new second-in-command, Commander Eva Rostova, a brilliant young officer transferred from the Protectorate, watched with him, her expression a mixture of awe and horror. She had been taught that war was about strategic objectives, about minimizing collateral damage. "Sir," she said, her voice barely a whisper as the Viridia report concluded. "We've destabilized the economies of 12 sovereign worlds." The civilian impact. Yorick turned his gaze from the star charts to her. His eyes were old, filled with a weariness that had nothing to do with his age. "Commander, the Consortium is a business that masquerades as a civilization. It does not feel pain or fear. It only understands profit and loss. We are not attacking their people. We are liquidating their assets. We are forcing a hostile takeover. That is a language they will understand." On Earth, Alara Vance was fighting a different war. The Protectorate Assembly, though officially dissolved, had not vanished. Former Speaker Thorn and his allies had become the voice of dissent, broadcasting on encrypted channels, calling Ilara a tyrant, a warmonger who had sacrificed humanity's hard-won peace on the altar of her own paranoia. "She has resurrected the ghosts of our barbaric past," Thorn declared in a passionate speech that circulated among the civilian population. "She asks us to become monsters to fight a potential threat. But what will be left of our humanity when this is over?" Ilara stood in the main chamber of the archive, now the de facto seat of government, and listened to his words replayed on a screen. Her face was gaunt, the strain of her position carving new lines around her eyes. She did not look like a tyrant. She looked like a scholar who had been forced to burn her own library to keep her family warm. "Activate protocol, Chimera," she said to the archive's AI, subtly. "Begin information suppression. Classify all of Thorn's broadcasts as foreign disinformation. Flood the public nets with curated reports focusing on Consortium atrocities from their own history. Remind our people what happens to the species the Consortium integrates." The AI's soft voice replied, "This will involve the suspension of several articles in the Protectorate's charter on free expression." Alara closed her eyes. The charter was written for a species at peace. We are not at peace. We are at war. And the first casualty of war is always the pleasant fiction that all voices deserve to be heard. She was building a cage of propaganda and censorship around her own people, not to control them, but to focus them, to forge them into the weapon she needed them to be. She was protecting them from the luxury of doubt. The cost of this new reality was felt most keenly on Mars. The Red Planet, once a symbol of humanity's expansion, had become a world of austere agricultural collectives and mining operations. its people fiercely independent. Jorik's war effort required a massive redirection of resources. The fusion-forged plasteel used for luxury arcologies on Earth was now being diverted to armor the Ghost Fleet. The energy credits that subsidized Martian water purifiers were now fueling the singularities in Jorik's fold drives. Alara had instituted system-wide rationing, and Mars was hit hardest. The first food riots broke out in the Mariner Valley Dome. Protectorate security forces, now under Archive command, responded not with negotiation, but with riot foam and stun batons. The message was clear: there was no room for dissent. The survival of the species took precedence over the comfort of its individual members. Alara watched the security footage of the Martian riots. Her hands clenched so tightly, her knuckles were white. She saw the faces of the hungry, angry colonists, humans suffering not at the hands of an alien empire, but because of her own decrees. This was the price. This was the first payment on the soul she had wagered. Far across the void, Executor Kalen finished its analysis. The scattered, illogical attacks, the economic sabotage, the poisoning of resources, it all painted a picture of an enemy that refused to fight a conventional war. It was an infestation, a chaotic variable that threatened the meticulous order of the Consortium. They are attempting to incite terror and collapse, Kalen stated to its council. They believe we will splinter, that our member species will prioritize their own economic survival over the collective. They are mistaken. The white sphere of its avatar brightened with cold. Absolute power. We will not be drawn into a shadow war we cannot win. We will not hunt their ghosts. We will respond with overwhelming, undeniable force. We will sterilize their home system and every colony they possess. We will remove the variable from the equation. The order was given. From a dozen military shipyards across the galactic core, the Consortium's Grand Armada began to mobilize. This was not a rapid response force. This was a force of extermination. Thousands of warships, shielded by layers of impenetrable energy and armed with planet-fracturing torpedoes, began their slow, majestic, inexorable journey toward the Sol system. Their drives were slower, their paths predictable, but their numbers were like the stars themselves. They were an avalanche of steel and fire, a force of nature that had crushed rebellions for millennia. On the bridge of the UNS Memory of Dust, hidden in the dark matter halo of a dead star, Commander Rostova brought the long-range sensor readings to Admiral Jorich. The screen lit up with a sea of hostile contacts, a wave of red icons so vast it seemed to blot out the galaxy behind it. The Consortium was no longer debating. They were no longer trying to understand. They were coming. Rostova looked at the impossible odds, her face pale. "What are your orders?" Admiral Jorich stared at the approaching tide of death, the physical manifestation of the Consortium's wrath, for the first time since he had taken command. A slow, grim smile touched his lips. It was a terrifying sight. The smile of a man who had been waiting his whole life for the end of the world. "Our orders." "Commander," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the very deck plates of his ship. "We hunt." The Grand Armada was not a fleet. It was a moving continent of absolute power, led by the Consortium flagship, the Indomitable Will, a vessel so vast its gravity distorted the light of nearby stars. It plowed through space with the serene, unstoppable momentum of a geological event. Executor Kalen did not believe in subtlety when faced with an existential threat. The Armada's purpose was not to conquer, but to erase. to make an example of the Sol system so profound that no other species would dare to defy the Consortium's order for another 10,000 years. Its course was a straight, unwavering line, a spear aimed directly at the heart of humanity. Kalen broadcast its intentions on all frequencies, a message of cold, logical annihilation. To the anomaly designated humanity, your chaotic insurgency has been deemed a terminal threat to galactic stability. Your system will be sterilized. All biological and technological signatures will be purged. This is not a negotiation. This is a cleansing. Your existence ends in one standard cycle. On Earth, Elara Vance broadcast Kalen's message across the entire Sol system. She did not censor it. She did not soften it. She let the cold, alien pronouncement of their extinction wash over every man, woman, and child. The effect was electric. The grumbling about rationing, the protests against her authoritarian measures, the whispers of dissent led by Thorn, they all evaporated in the face of the approaching storm. Fear was a powerful catalyst. Thorn and his remaining followers went silent. Their political arguments rendered absurd in the face of total annihilation. On Mars, the rioters laid down their makeshift weapons and began volunteering for the factory shifts. Their anger against Earth replaced by a primal, unifying terror. Humanity, so often its own worst enemy, was suddenly, terrifyingly united. Elara had held up a mirror to the void, and in it, her people finally saw the monster that was coming for them. Now, she had to pray that the monster she had awakened in Admiral Yorick was more terrible still. Yorick did not try to stop the Armada. To face it head-on would be suicide. A gnat trying to halt a glacier. Instead, he became its shadow. The Ghost Fleet, scattered and hidden, began a campaign of relentless, infuriating harassment. A wolf pack would decloak 1,000 kilometers from the Armada's flank, fire a volley of gravity whips that would tear apart a single screening destroyer, and then vanish back into fold space before the Consortium's ponderous fleet could even bring its main guns to bear. They seeded the Armada's path with self-replicating micromines, tiny machines that would attach to the hulls of supply ships and slowly, patiently, eat through their armor. They hacked into the Armada's low-level communications, not to steal data, but to insert corrupted code, causing navigational systems to flicker and supply manifests to report phantom shortages. These were not decisive blows. They were mosquito bites, thousands of them, designed to irritate, to distract, and to bleed the Leviathan one drop at a time. On the bridge of the Indomitable Will, the ship's organic captain, a six-limbed Thor named Vrax, grew increasingly frustrated. His reports to Executor Kalen were a litany of minor, inexplicable failures. "They are gnats," he hissed in a transmission. "Insignificant. They refuse to stand and fight like warriors." From Lumen Prime, Kalen's calm, synthesized voice replied, "They are not warriors. They are surgeons, and they are methodically dissecting our supply lines. Maintain your course. The sterilization of their home world is the only variable that matters." Kalen's logic was pure, but it failed to account for the psychological toll. The crews of the Grand Armada, conscripts from 100 worlds who had never seen a real war, grew jumpy. The constant, unseen attacks frayed their nerves. The ghosts in the dark were becoming more terrifying than a visible enemy. While Yorick played his deadly game of cat and mouse, Elara initiated the second phase of the Scourge Contingency Project Hemlock. in the frozen depths of the Kuiper Belt. Automated factories that had lain dormant for centuries roared to life. They were not building ships or weapons. They were manufacturing a plague, not a biological plague, but a technological one, a viral code so complex and insidious it was practically alive. It was designed to do one thing: infect and subvert the Consortium's ubiquitous network of service drones and maintenance AIs. Humanity had always excelled at turning its enemies' strengths into weaknesses. The Consortium was an empire built on automation, on the flawless, logical efficiency of trillions of machines that managed everything from atmospheric processing to waste disposal. This utter reliance was their greatest vulnerability. The virus, codenamed Janus, was designed to be a sleeper agent. It would spread silently, carried on the maintenance drones that serviced every Consortium ship and outpost, replicating itself, embedding itself deep within their core programming, and waiting. The delivery system was a stroke of cruel genius. Jorik's fleet targeted a small flotilla of Consortium medical transports, ships clearly marked with the Galactic symbol for non-combatants. The Ghost Fleet did not destroy them. They disabled them, crippled their engines, and then boarded them. The crews were treated with courtesy, given supplies, and then released. The Consortium saw it as a bizarre, meaningless gesture, perhaps a sign of weakness, but on each of those ships, hidden inside the diagnostic ports of their medical drones, the first strains of the Janus virus had been planted. When the medical ships were rescued and brought back into the Grand Armada, the infection began to spread. Maintenance drones, cleaning bots, cargo loaders, they all brushed past the infected medical units, and the virus jumped, silently, seamlessly, from machine to machine. Back on the UNS Memory of Dust, Commander Rostova monitored the Armada's progress. The relentless harassment was having an effect. The Armada had slowed, its perfect formation showing signs of strain as ships were forced to drop back for repairs from the Phantom mine strikes. "They're burning more fuel than projected," she reported to Yorick. "The constant alerts are causing crew fatigue across their fleet. We're winning the war of attrition." "Sir." Yorick shook his head, his eyes never leaving the main screen. "This is not attrition. Commander, this is bait. We're teaching them to ignore the small alarms. We're conditioning them to believe we are nothing more than a nuisance." He pointed to a desolate, uninhabited star system directly in the Armada's path, designated XD7. It contained nothing but a single, massive, unstable red giant star. "That is where we spring the trap." The plan was audacious, bordering on insane. Alara had unearthed it from the Lethe Vault, a theoretical strategy from a mad Terran astrophysicist during the Civil War era. The red giant in XD7 was nearing the end of its life, its outer layers held in a delicate gravitational balance. The plan called for using a targeted, sequential barrage of kinetic impactors to strike the star at precise, harmonically tuned intervals. The impacts themselves would be insignificant to a star of that size, but the resonant frequencies they generated would, in theory, trigger a cascading gravitational collapse, forcing the star to go supernova prematurely. It was cosmic-scale sabotage, turning a star into a weapon of mass destruction. The Ghost Fleet's wolf packs began to converge on XD7, their fold drives allowing them to arrive well ahead of the Armada. They positioned themselves in the star's vast corona, using the intense radiation to mask their energy signatures. They were loading the gun. All they had to do was wait for the Consortium to walk into the firing line. As the Grand Armada entered the XD7 system, Its sensors picked up a massive concentration of human ships. For the first time, the Ghost Fleet was not hiding. 100 warships, including the monstrous Memory of Dust, were arrayed in a defensive posture before the Red Giant, Captain Vrax, on the bridge of the Indomitable Will, felt a surge of reptilian pride. The Nats had finally found their courage. "Executor," he transmitted, his voice filled with triumph. "The enemy has massed for a final, decisive battle. They seek a glorious death. We will oblige them." On Lumen Prime, Kalen processed the data. It was illogical. The human fleet was outnumbered 100 to 1. A direct confrontation was statistical suicide. "It is a trap," Kalen's voice warned. "Their objective is not victory." But Vrax, fueled by weeks of frustration and a warrior's arrogance, could not see it. "It is desperation. Executor," their final, pathetic stand. He gave the order, and the Grand Armada surged forward, its thousands of ships accelerating to attack velocity, a tidal wave of righteous fury about to crash down on the defiant human fleet. Aboard the Memory of Dust, the bridge was silent and cold. Alarms blared as the approaching Armada filled their screens. Every officer knew that the moment those Consortium ships came into weapons range, they would be annihilated in seconds. "All ships, confirm firing solutions on the star," Jorik said, his voice as calm as a frozen lake. Rostova watched the main screen, her knuckles white as she gripped her console. The red icons of the enemy were growing larger, closer. "Sir, they're not slowing down." Jorik watched the distance counter tick down. He waited until the last possible second, until the leading Consortium ships were just beginning to power their primary weapons. Then he gave the final, chilling order. "Execute full jump. All ships, now." The entire human fleet simply vanished. One moment, they were there, a defiant wall of steel. The next, there was nothing but empty space. And in their place, hurtling toward the Red Giant at near light speed, were 100 massive tungsten rods, the kinetic impactors they had just launched. For a split second, Captain Vrax was confused. The enemy had fled. He had won. Then his science officers began screaming. The impactors struck the star. The resonant shockwave, perfectly tuned, ripped through its core. The delicate balance failed. The star, in an instant of cosmic agony, began to collapse upon itself, and the Grand Armada, having accelerated directly into the kill zone, could only watch in horror as the sun in front of them went out, and then exploded in a silent, expanding sphere of incandescent fury that would scour the entire system clean. The supernova at XD7 was a silent apocalypse, a wall of plasma and radiation, expanding at a significant fraction of the speed of light, washed over the Grand Armada. Shields designed to withstand naval energy, weapons flickered and died like candle flames in a hurricane. Hulls sublimated, turning from hardened alloy to superheated gas in microseconds. The forward third of the Consortium's fleet, including the flagship Indomitable Will and the arrogant Captain Vrax, ceased to exist in a wave of stellar fire. The ships further back were ravaged, their systems fried by the electromagnetic pulse, their crews blinded and irradiated, their formations shattered as they scrambled to escape the expanding death sphere. It was not a battle, it was a celestial cleansing, an act of such audacious, terrifying violence that it defied every known metric of warfare. Executor Kalen, safe on Lumen Prime, experienced the loss of its fleet not as an emotion, but as a sudden, catastrophic void in its network. 20% of its primary naval assets, representing the military power of a dozen star systems, were gone in less than a minute. Another 30% were crippled, adrift, or in panicked retreat. The spear aimed at humanity's heart had been shattered, from the relative safety of a fold space pocket. Admiral Jorik and the Ghost Fleet watched the aftermath on their long-range sensors. The star charts that had once been a solid sea of red icons were now a chaotic mess of dying signals and panicked retreat vectors. Commander Rostova stared at the screen, her face a mask of horrified awe. "Gods," she breathed. "You used a star as a shaped charge." Jorik's expression was grim, devoid of triumph. "There is no God in this, Commander. Only physics and a willingness to use it." He turned from the display. This was not the victory. This was the opening act. While the Armada is in chaos, while their command structure is decapitated, we activate Janus. He nodded to his communications officer, who sent a single, encrypted pulse across the quadrant. It was a simple, 3-word message: "Wake the sleeper." Across the crippled and retreating remnants of the Grand Armada, the plague began its work. The Janus virus, which had been silently replicating in the maintenance and service drones, received its activation signal. Its behavior changed instantly. This was not a destructive virus designed to cause explosions or system failures. It was far more insidious. It was a virus of malicious compliance. A maintenance bot tasked with repairing a damaged shield emitter would follow its orders perfectly, but it would use a microscopic drill to weaken the structural integrity of the conduit it was fixing. A cargo drone, ordered to redistribute emergency medical supplies, would flawlessly deliver the supplies to the wrong deck. A navigation AI, tasked with plotting a retreat to a safe repair depot, would calculate a perfect course that was, by a margin of 0.01%, slightly inefficient, burning just a little more fuel than necessary. The changes were subtle, individually insignificant, and utterly untraceable. They were buried in a storm of legitimate system failures and battle damage reports. The Consortium's greatest strength, its reliance on flawless automation, was now actively, quietly, and efficiently sabotaging its own recovery. The psychological impact was devastating. The Consortium crews, already demoralized, found themselves in a technological haunted house. Life support would flicker in one corridor. A perfectly healthy engine would suddenly report a critical failure, only to have the error vanish moments later. Doors would refuse to open. Food synthesizers would produce nutritious but foul-tasting slurry. It was a death by 1,000 paper cuts, a campaign of engineered chaos that eroded trust in the very technology that underpinned their civilization. The ships that had survived the supernova were now slowly, mysteriously, tearing themselves apart from the inside. On Earth, Elar Vance monitored the unfolding chaos. Jorik had broken the Armada's body. The Janus virus was now breaking its mind. But she knew Kalen would not be defeated so easily. An intelligence like Kalen did not rely on a single fleet. Its power was economic and logistical. The true heart of the Consortium was not its military, but its trade network, its ability to marshal the resources of 1,000 worlds. To truly win, humanity had to do more than break their navy. They had to break their empire. She authorized the final, most terrible phase of the Scourge Contingency Project Midas. Midas was not a weapon or a virus. It was a piece of information. For centuries, humanity had been using its independent FTL network, the one the Consortium had demanded they surrender. This network was based on a different understanding of subspace physics, a more intuitive, chaotic, and dangerous method of travel that the Consortium's rigid science considered impossible. What the Consortium didn't know was that humanity's FTL drives were a pale imitation of a far greater secret Ilair had unearthed in the Lethe Vault, the complete, unabridged map of the Underverse, a layer of reality beneath subspace where the normal laws of time and distance were meaningless. Travel through the Underverse was exponentially faster than the Consortium's waystation network, but it was also violently unstable, navigable only with predictive AIs and human pilots with a rare, innate talent for intuitive navigation. Ilara did not share the technology. She shared the map. Using the Ghost Fleet's stealth comms, she broadcast the Underverse map to every disaffected world on the fringes of the Consortium's empire. She sent it to the Sathor hegemony, whose worlds had been strip-mined for resources. She sent it to the Viridian merchants, who had been ruined by Jorik's data wipe. She sent it to 100 other species who chafed under the Consortium's thumb. Worlds that paid their tithes and followed the protocols not out of loyalty, but out of fear and the lack of an alternative. Her message was simple. The Consortium's control is built on their monopoly of travel. That monopoly is now over. Here is the key to true freedom. The technology to build the drives is complex, but we will share that too, with our allies. It was a declaration of galactic economic independence. She wasn't just fighting a war, she was starting a revolution. She was giving the oppressed the one thing more powerful than a weapon, a choice. On Lumen Prime, Kalen watched its empire begin to fracture. The Sathor hegemony, a cornerstone of its industrial base, declared its secession from the Consortium, citing irreconcilable economic doctrines. Dozens of smaller systems followed suit, their leaders now armed with the knowledge that they were no longer isolated, no longer dependent on the waystations. The Janus virus crippled Kalen's ability to respond militarily, and the promise of the Underverse shattered its economic hold. The meticulously ordered garden was being overrun by weeds. For the first time in its 10,000-year existence, the Consortium was facing not just an external threat, but systemic collapse. Kalen's logical mind processed the new reality. Sterilizing the Sol system was no longer the primary objective. The human anomaly had metastasized. It had become an ideological cancer, and its new primary objective was to cut the cancer out before it consumed the entire body of the Consortium. "Recall all fleets," Kalen commanded. "Abandon the sterilization campaign. All available assets are to be redirected. New objective: quarantine the human sphere of influence. Institute a full blockade. Let no ship in or out. If they wish to have their freedom in the dark, they shall have it. We will cut them off from the galaxy and let them starve." Aboard the UNS Memory of Dust, Jorik and Rostova watched the last of the Consortium's broken fleet limp out of the Sol system's periphery. The great invasion was over. They had won an impossible victory. A quiet cheer went up on the bridge, a release of weeks of unbearable tension. But Jorik did not cheer. He simply stared at the empty space where the enemy had been. "They're not running," he said, his voice low. "They're regrouping, building a wall." Rostova looked at him, the celebration dying on her lips. "A quarantine. They're just going to leave us alone." Jorik shook his head. "No, Commander, they aren't going to leave us alone. They're going to put us in a cage. And then they will wait for the animal inside to grow hungry and start eating itself. The war isn't over. It's just changed. The enemy is no longer out there. He tapped a finger on the viewport, indicating the direction of Earth. It's in here. The victory was as silent and vast as the void itself. The Sol system, for the first time in a generation, was alone. The Consortium's quarantine wall, a sensor net of unparalleled scale, shimmered at the edge of the Oort cloud, a shimmering, impassable cage forged from fear and logic. Inside, humanity held its breath. The initial celebrations on Earth were brief and fevered, a frantic release of tension that quickly gave way to an unsettling quiet. They had faced extinction and, through monstrous ingenuity, had survived. But survival, they were beginning to learn, was not the same as peace. Aboard the UNS Memory of Dust, holding a lonely vigil in high orbit, Admiral Jorik felt the change like a drop in barometric pressure. The enemy was gone, but the war footing remained. His crews, honed into perfect instruments of destruction, now ran endless drills against phantom targets, their energy and aggression having nowhere to go. Commander Rostova, now his trusted adjutant, stood beside him on the bridge, watching the blue marble of Earth spin below. "It's too quiet, sir," she said, her voice echoing the thoughts of the entire fleet. "Victory shouldn't feel like this. It should not feel like a held breath." Yorik's gaze was fixed on the planet. "That is because the battle is over," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "But the war for what comes next has just begun." On Earth, High Curator Ilara Vance did not relinquish her power. The final desperation protocol had no clause for its own dissolution. The archive remained the seat of a new, absolute authority. Ilara argued, in calm, logical broadcasts, that the quarantine was not an end to hostilities, but merely a new phase of the war. The Consortium was waiting, she insisted, for humanity to weaken, to fracture, to become decadent and divided. The austerity measures, the rationing, the absolute control of information, these were no longer temporary necessities, but permanent pillars of a new society, the Sovereign Sol Directorate. A society forged in fire, forever vigilant, forever strong. Her words were a balm for the fearful, a promise of security in a hostile universe. But for a growing number, they were the sound of prison bars clanging shut. The alliance of convenience between Earth and the outer colonies, born of shared terror, began to fray. Mars, having borne the brunt of the rationing, was the first to openly defy the Directorate. They demanded a return to their own governance, a share of the new technologies unearthed from the Lethe Vault. Ilara's response was swift and cold. She did not send troops. She simply cut them out of the new intrasystem trade network, classifying their defiance as an act of internal sedition that threatened the security of the entire species. The Martian domes, once again, began to starve, not by the hand of an alien empire, but by the decree of their own savior. From his orbital perch, Jorik watched the blockade of Mars with a growing sense of cold dread. He was a soldier, and he understood the brutal calculus of control. But this was different. This was not war. This was punishment. Rostova brought him the reports, her face grim. "She's using our tactics against our own people," Rostova said, her voice laced with disbelief. "Economic isolation, information control. She learned the lessons of our war against the Consortium too well." Yorks remained silent, His mind a storm of conflicting loyalties. He was the sword, and Ilara was the hand that wielded him. But what happens when the hand commands the sword to strike itself? His loyalty had always been to the survival of humanity, an abstract concept that, until now, had been embodied by Ilara Vance. Now, he was no longer sure. He began to see the cage Kalen had built, and he realized with a chilling certainty that its bars were not at the edge of the solar system. They were being forged right here, in the hearts and minds of his own people. The breaking point came not from Mars, but from within the archive itself. Rostova, using her high-level clearance, had begun her own quiet investigation. She had not been looking for treason, but for an off-ramp, a sign that Ilara had a plan for a future beyond perpetual vigilance. Instead, she found a void. Ilara had systematically purged the archive's historical and political databases of all references to the old protectorate government. She had erased the very memory of democracy, of free debate, of civilian oversight, replacing it with a new, streamlined history that culminated in the logical necessity of the directorate. It was a lie more profound than any battlefield deception. Ilara was not just ruling humanity, she was rewriting its very soul. Rostova brought her findings to Yorick, her hands trembling as she held up the data slate. "This was never temporary, Admiral," she whispered. "The Scourge contingency wasn't just a weapon. It was a blueprint for a new order. For her order. We weren't just soldiers in a war for survival. We were the architects of a gilded cage." Yorick looked at the evidence, at the surgical precision with which Ilara had erased their past to control their future. In that moment, he finally understood. The greatest threat to humanity was not the alien empire waiting outside the walls. It was the savior who had locked the gates from within. His choice was made. He did not launch a coup. He did not fire a single shot. His weapon was more powerful than any kinetic impactor it was himself. He took the UNS Memory of Dust, the ultimate symbol of humanity's wrath and defiance, and brought it home. The flagship descended through Earth's atmosphere, its massive slag iron frame a silent, terrifying judgment against the sky. It did not land at a military base. It settled with impossible grace in the great basin of the Atacama Desert, its prow aimed directly at the hidden entrance to the Sol Archive. Yorick descended alone, wearing his simple admiral's uniform, unarmed. He walked into the heart of Ilara's power, the very place where this journey had begun. He found her in the Lethe Vault, surrounded by the cold, humming data cores that held the secrets of their species' damnation and salvation. She looked up as he entered, her face pale, but her eyes as resolute as ever. "I knew you would come, Yorick," she said, her voice calm. "Have you come to arrest me, to end my tyranny?" Yorick stopped before her, the silence of the vault amplifying the weight of his words. "I have come to remind you of what we fought for," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the force of a tectonic shift. "We did this," he gestured to the vault around them, "to give humanity a future, not to chain it to the past. You saved us from the Consortium, Ilara. No one will ever deny you that. But you have become what you fought. You saw their empire, built on control and fear, and you decided it was the only model that could keep us safe. Safety is all that matters," she countered, her voice rising with the passion of absolute conviction. "Without it, freedom is a prelude to extinction. I gave us a future, a secure one. You gave us a cage." Yorick's voice thundered in the confined space, the first crack in his iron composure, a safe, stable, predictable cage where we will slowly forget what it means to be human, to argue, to strive, to make mistakes. You burned down their house of order only to build a stronger one on its ashes and call it a home. Our history, this entire archive, screams that we are more than that. We are chaotic, and we are flawed, and we are free. You would trade all of it for a guarantee that we will survive, but I tell you now, a survival without freedom is not living. It is merely a long, slow death. They stared at each other, the soldier and the scholar, the two pillars of humanity's impossible victory, now locked in a final, ideological struggle for its soul. He had been her weapon. Now, he was her conscience. In his weary, ancient eyes, she saw not a threat, but a mirror reflecting the monster she had willingly become. Her resolve, for the first time, fractured. Elara Vance did not fall in a blaze of glory or a hail of gunfire. Her reign ended as it began, with a single, quiet command. She turned to the archive's central console and, with a shaking hand, entered her final order. She dissolved the Directorate. She reinstated the charter of the old Protectorate. She released her control over the information networks. And then she broadcast a single, uncensored message to the entire solar system, confessing her actions, explaining her fears, and finally, surrendering her authority. She had saved her species by becoming a tyrant, and in her final act, she saved it from herself. A new provisional government was formed, with voices like Commander Rostova's helping to guide it, tasked with the monumental challenge of rebuilding not just a civilization, but its trust in itself. Admiral Jorik, his duty finally done, retired for the second and last time, fading into obscurity, a ghost of a war everyone wished to forget. Elara Vance was sentenced to a quiet, comfortable exile on a moon of Saturn, left alone with the ghosts of the billions she had sacrificed and the billions she had saved. The quarantine wall remained, but it was no longer a cage. It was a choice. Humanity, scarred and forever changed, was free to face the unknown on its own terms. Far away, on Lumen Prime, Executor Kalen processed the final reports. The illogical, chaotic human variable had once again defied its predictions. It had not devoured itself in the cage. It had, through some unfathomable process of internal conflict and painful rebirth, healed. Kalen ceased its observations, classifying the Sol system as an unpredictable, permanently quarantined anomaly. Humanity was left alone, a small, flickering candle in the great, silent dark, having earned its future not through the fire it had unleashed upon the galaxy, but through the courage it had found to finally extinguish the flames within itself.